Welcome back to Rethinking Politics. We're glad to have you here with us for another episode. Today, we decided that we want to talk about criminal justice. It's a topic that we've discussed several times before. We want to revisit it, and the reason why is because although we've addressed a couple of pivotal areas, we've talked about our idea of restorative justice, we've talked about a lot of self-defense stuff related to Kyle Rittenhouse, we've talked about police authority, and police abuse. Our first episode was about that, year and a half ago or so. Because it's been a hot button issue, the past 2 years, in particular in regards to police authority and Black Lives Matter. And that's gotten a lot of attention and focus, talking about, the dangers that the police have. Not even the dangers, but the threat that the police have posed to our society. It's interesting, Dan, you mentioned a study that was done I can't talk today.
That's okay. That's not important. It's not like we're here to talk.
No, not at all. A study that was conducted to find out what people believed, and there was a sizable group of people who in that study stated that they thought the number of unarmed black men who had been killed by the police was around 10,000 in the past year. And that number may not be exact, but the point is that they were way, way over the mark on something that is, in general, a very rare event.
Yeah, the actual number was like 13. I don't remember if that was this last year or the year before. That's probably 2019 numbers or 2020.
And not to mitigate those deaths at all, not to mitigate the goal of some of these movements, because there is something to be done in terms of addressing police brutality. There is something to be done in addressing many of these broken systems, but the one that we feel really needs to be looked at is criminal justice. And the reason for that is because, yes, 13 unarmed black men, were shot in 2019 or whatever the year is. That's bad. But what's much worse, for those who are concerned about the demographic differences in terms of criminal justice, what's much worse is the fact that at some point in their lifetime, 1 out of 3 black men will be incarcerated in some form versus, 1 in 9 men in general, or 1 in 17 white men. Those are the numbers that I personally am much more concerned about.
Right. And one of the interesting things about these statistics, we've gone through this kind of a breakdown before where you look at these numbers and you try and figure out the causality, right? The fact that there is a disparity is the norm in statistics, right? The fact that there are different outcomes is the norm. But when you start to compare the number of people we put in prison to other nations, again, a disparity should be the norm, but we put, per capita, we have 707 people, as opposed to Russia, that has 470, Thailand, that has 413. Yeah, for every 100,000, sorry. Russia has 470, Thailand 413. They are our closest competitors. We're number 1 on this list. Of the 50 most populous nations, we're number 1 for number of people in prison per 100,000. It's ridiculously high. We are imprisoning an obscene amount of people. And the question is why, right? Why is that happening? How do you end up with where 1/3 of black men will be incarcerated at some point? That includes jail and prison, but obviously the prison numbers for black men is also much higher than the norm.
Well, and it's not just, and my concern here is primarily not the disparity. If 1 out of every 3,000 black men, were going to spend time in prison in their lifetime versus 1 in 6,000 white men, I'd be much less concerned. What I'm concerned about is that 1 in 3 number. The fact that if you have a group of if you're black and you have 2 brothers and you're a boy growing up, statistically speaking, one of you is going to spend time in jail. And obviously that's not how statistics work, but that knowledge,
no, you're right. Yeah.
For me growing up would make me very uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's not the relative difference. It's the absolute number. 1 in 3 is ridiculous.
And And there are more numbers that are really disturbing. 2.3 million people are currently incarcerated. That's between local jails, state prisons, federal prisons, so many different areas. What's crazy is that about 470,000 of those 2.3 million have not yet been convicted of a crime. So about 1 in 5 of the people currently incarcerated in the United States, 1 in 5 of those is currently not proven guilty and is therefore under the law supposed to be innocent. You know what I mean? We talked about drug laws before and about how a lot of these people are in prison when they shouldn't be. Well, regardless of how you feel about drug laws, if you agree that innocent until proven guilty, then you believe that 1 out of 5 people currently incarcerated is at least technically innocent. And that's crazy.
Right. It's odd. You compare the number of people we have incarcerated who have not been proved, that 470,000 number, people who we're not sure if they're guilty or not. They haven't gone through the processes. And you say, and you compare them to the numbers of other countries. So for every 7 people we have in prison, France has 1, roughly. It's like 707 to 101. We have more people in prison who have not been convicted, more people in jail who've not been convicted than France has in prison altogether, right? Relative to the population. And that's true of every, I didn't look super close, every European country. We have a higher number of the population in prison on suspected crimes, right? Conviction may or may not happen than they have altogether. And that's taking into account population. Right, per 100,000 people.
Looking at the list, I don't think that's true of Poland.
Poland is,
but I think of every other country.
Yeah.
Spain, the UK, Australia is not a European country, but I think of it as UK part too.
It is. It is European. Let's be clear. It's certainly
Italy,
not Asian,
France,
which
Germany,
is the other option.
A lot of these countries, it's far lower. If you look at like Germany, for example, has a super low rate. Japan, another Western country, has an incredibly low rate compared to the United States. They have 50 for every 100,000 compared to our 700, which basically means that for every 3 people that are currently incarcerated in the United States without being convicted of a crime, Japan has 1 person incarcerated, period.
Who probably has been convicted. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's just nuts.
Yeah, Italy, France, South Korea, Philippines, Canada, most of the countries that we associate with, that we compare ourselves to, are between 77 and about 130 on this list, give or take some. And we're up at 700 and, 707. We're many, many times the number of most other countries. Now, it's possible that that's because they should be there, right? That is possible. The number doesn't prove something.
And that is an argument that's occasionally made. But what's interesting, Dan, is that our incarceration rates have jumped in the last few decades, but our rates of violence have actually gone way down. We have violent crime is about half the rates that it was, 20, 30 years ago. And I lost the page that has those exact numbers, so I can't tell you exactly what they were. Oh, here it is. I found it. Yeah, so if you look back at 1990 versus 2020, it's about half the violent crime rate per 100,000 of the population today than it was 30 years ago. And of course, a lot of people argue, well, that's because we got strict on crime back in the 80s and 90s and stopped people from committing crimes. That the reason crime rate has gone down is because there are 2 million people in prison. The reality is they've actually done studies trying to find that link, and it's just not there. That doesn't work that way. That if it worked that way, the changes would have been a little bit different.
And there's no question that that sometimes the problem is that they're not enforcing laws, right? That can be the reason that crime is a problem, right? And by enforcing the laws, you can often decrease crime. It's not to say that there's no link between the two. It's that looking at these overall numbers and what's caused the decrease in crime, and why there's a decrease in crime on one hand and an increase of people in prison on the other hand is not a causative here. They're going at different different rates in different times.
Like, let me give you an example. So 1990 when the crime rate was way higher, but it starts to drop off back in the 90s, right? Well, in 1992, you still only had 70,000 people serving life sentences, so not very many. Versus, it was only in the 2000s where that number really started to jump. After the crime rates had already gone down, we started having more people serve life sentences. You know what I mean? So the cause and effect is in many ways reversed. That after the crime rate started going down, we started throwing more people into prison, not the other way around.
Interesting. Yeah, the trend begins before what the claimed cause.
Yeah, so even though they look like they're two matching graphs, they're really not.
This happened a lot it was very difficult during COVID to identify when people would argue that it was the lockdowns causing the decrease, when a closer look revealed that actually it began before the lockdowns would have actually had the impact.
That it starts dropping off and then they lock down.
Yeah, right. That it hits a certain peak and then in the fear they lock down and then it ends up looking causative when it in fact isn't. Yeah, it's interesting trying to sift through the data. The point of all this is to say that 2.3 million people is really, really, really high relative to our population. It's really high. And the idea that there's police abuse and that some people are being put away for crimes they didn't commit, obviously there's that question, right? How many of the people being convicted of crimes are actually innocent of the crimes? Setting that aside, there are far too many people in prison. Unless they are actually dangerous, we want to look at is how do you go through and look at crimes, look at the procedures and things, and try and correct some of this. Try and see, again, to some degree, we're assuming there's a problem because of the relative numbers. I look at, we were talking about it before, where we grew up and the relative crime rates. Let's just say that it varies immensely, right? Some places you're going to see crime all the time, and people are probably involved in crimes. Other places, it's extremely rare, right? It varies dramatically. Infamously, the big cities are the crime hubs, and there's reasons for that. There's more money to be made by doing certain things that are often the points at which all of the crime happens around. Things like gangs, right? You don't get gangs in a small town rural area, generally speaking.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. It just wouldn't be profitable, right? They don't have the areas to organize around a drug distribution, for example, right? A gang has to be making money. They're organized around some kind of economic benefit on a black market, and they then use that to, they're fighting for territory, the violence, all these things are centered around some kind of money-making mechanism, in which they use that to draw everybody in and control everything. That just isn't going to happen in a rural area for the same reason big businesses aren't moving to rural areas.
Yeah, and that's something that we've brought up before about how so many of the violent crimes that are committed are a byproduct of the fact that the drug markets are illegal, and that if you change drug laws, you would erase a whole chunk of incentives to even commit these crimes.
Yes.
That so many people are committing crimes because their livelihoods are attached to their criminal lives in a very concrete way. Not like, oh, I'm going to steal this TV because I want it, but I work, my job is to work for, drug distribution, which is illegal. And there are a huge number of people in the United States who are employed in that profession. I call it a profession. That's obviously a term of word choice, but that's what it is. You've got a whole career path set up that's at least decently lucrative, that's completely illegal, is associated with violent crime on top of the already, drug-related crimes, that gets people killed, that gets people arrested, that gets people serving these ridiculously long sentences. that could all be circumvented if you legalized drugs and regulated them in a different way.
Yes.
But we don't want to focus too much on that because we've talked about that before.
Yes. To give you a few numbers. So the drugs, we looked at it. It makes up something like 430,000 is the number we came to, 450,000, somewhere in there.
Somewhere around there in the 400s.
This year, 2021 and 2022 are going to be worse. Crimes went up for the first time in a long time in a variety of ways under COVID and the lockdowns and things. So this is from we're looking at 2020 and before data. But so those numbers include a wide variety of people. Some of it's drug possession. Most of it's not drug possession. People, it's relatively uncommon. It's still very common, but it's relative to other drug charges. Drug possession is a small portion. But then you look at other things. So it makes up about 450,000, say 430,000 of the 2.3 million. That's a lot. That's a fifth. That's equal. That's just slightly smaller than the group that's not convicted. And as Brad was indicating, so many other crimes happen in relation to drugs.
Because of those drugs.
Right. It's exchanges on a black market. If you're not familiar with this idea and why it is, it's not, and again, I'll say this point that we make in greater detail there. It's not because the drugs make them make poor choices. It's not directly the effect of the drugs on their minds. It's not that we have a bunch of crazy people who are crazy because of the drugs doing these things. It's primarily the effect of a black market, exchanges and the risks and dangers there. And yes, the drugs then obviously aren't helping, right? The fact that they may be taking their own products, right? And the other people in there. There are crimes of desperation of people on hard drugs who are violent because of the drugs.
That's a very small percentage of the crimes we're talking about.
Yeah, it is the illegal nature of the market and the risks associated with exchanging goods illegally that lead so much to violence. They don't have a way to deal with disputes.
Yeah, there's no recourse system set in place.
Right, the ability to trust and make exchanges when they could backstab you and there's no real recourse. All of these things play a role in making it so that around the 450,000 drug convictions, there are an additional amount of violent and property convictions. And the chart that I'm looking at has drug convictions, property, violence, etc. It divides them up by categories, and you're only listed under each of these categories once. So if you're listed under a violent crime, you're not going to be listed under a drug crime, right? They're taking the most severe crime and they're listing that as your primary thing. But so much of the violence is related to the drugs because of financial incentives and the black market issues. So anyway, we don't actually know how many people are caught up in the drug problem, but legalizing them could affect as many as, 1 million of the 2.3 million. It could be a ridiculous amount of them that are in something related.
But before we get too far down the rabbit hole, Dan, I want to help illustrate or at least clearly define what I think the issue is, because a lot of people see this problem. A lot of people talk about the 2.3 million people incarcerated. A lot of people talk about how many black men are in prison right now and how it's a serious concern. A lot of people talk about these drug laws and all these people who are getting arrested, and it's a serious problem. But then when it comes to solutions, it gets a bit more complicated. You always have an obvious solution is you can arrest more white men. You know what I mean? And then you can balance things out.
You go straight social justice or release more black men.
Yeah, or release more black men indiscriminately, or you can, you look at, California where they're trying to do things like they're trying to legalize, petty theft in order to keep people out of prison because there's no principled understanding of what's going on. They're just trying to fix the outcomes. You know what I mean? They see the number 2.3 million and they're like, we have to change this number, which means we need less people in prison. So let's stop arresting people, stop charging people, and let people out of prison. And that's And a lot of conservatives are freaking out about that with good reason, because you're just as likely to let out people who shouldn't be let out as you are people who should be let out. That unless you believe that no one should ever serve prison time, you do believe there is a just reason for prison. You know, there are a lot of people who are behind bars right now for murder. And letting those people out, I think most of us can agree, is not a good idea. And
Yeah.
so what that means is that we can't just say the system is broken. We need to have concrete ideas of how to fix it. And the best way to have concrete ideas that are actually going to be effective and that are actually going to be just, because this is a criminal justice system we're talking about here, is to have them be based on some kind of principle, some kind of universal rule that we can learn to apply effectively. And so that's what I want to first start talking about, is what are the principles that we should be looking at so that we don't do what California is doing, but we can also effectively make a change.
That's a great point. And you're right. In the discussion of numbers, it often does become like, well, if the numbers are the problem, we can easily change the numbers.
Yeah.
But you're right that fundamentally what you want is the only way that 2.3 million people in prison incarcerated is a problem is if they don't deserve to be there, right? If it's unjust.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in many cases, of course, in a system as big as the U.S., there will always be some people in there who don't belong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people who it's unjust, and it's always worth the effort to try and change it to be more just, right? That's a given. But yes, if we lose track of how it connects to justice and not social justice, not just group numbers.
No, but individual justice.
Actual people who've, committed crime. You don't want to release people who are threats any more than you want to keep people in who are innocent. That's the goal. So you're right. It has to be from the ground up, and the drug discussion could have started from that point, as we do when we talk about it in more detail. And we won't talk about it too much more in this. But the principle under the drug issue is that they're not harming someone else. And we'll get into the principles and talk about, like you said, develop principles of what laws should be there, and upon what principles do we establish a mutually agreeable system of justice. We'll say that. Obviously, there's going to be disagreements in various areas, but in general, get something we can agree upon as a system that doesn't put a lot of people in there who don't need to be there, and keeps as many innocent people out of there as possible.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to principles of justice, there are some that people readily agree on. You know, one that I already mentioned is the idea of innocent until proven guilty. In the United States, that's a principle that's universally accepted. The idea that, well, I mean, that's part of where the whole police brutality thing comes from, because historically, and in many countries even to this day, police officers have the ability to punish you before ascertaining your guilt. You know what I mean? And that's what police brutality in many ways is you're being punished before it's proven that you committed the crime. If you weren't innocent until proven guilty, there would be no problem with that. You know what I mean? You're guilty because the police think you're guilty, and we move on from there. Yeah,
this is in some ways the problem with torture, right? And in the circumstances of where you're trying to get a confession.
Yeah, exactly. And you torture them to get your confession. And the innocent until proven guilty principle would stop that.
And it makes perfect sense from a perspective of, if I'm a police officer and you're a potential criminal, Brad, and I think it's important that you are not committing an injustice. Upon what grounds would I say that's important, that it's important for you not to be unjust, but it's okay if I'm unjust? I mean, that doesn't... It doesn't basic logic. I really think it's just a logical application of the idea that if justice matters, then the enforcers ought to be just. Right? It's not complicated. And it's why I think it's got universal agreement.
Yeah, and another way of looking at it is that if those who aren't guilty start getting punished by the government in any form, then at that point the government itself becomes a guilty party. You know what I mean? That's what police brutality is where, the police themselves are the ones committing the crimes,
Yes,
which as we've seen is sometimes does happen
it
and does
does.
need to be addressed. And we're glad that it is being addressed.
Yeah, you could say the whole entire the entire basis of the movement towards what we would describe today as broadly as modern democracies is upon the basis that that governments um, that governments inherently need to be protecting the citizens or helping the
Yeah.
citizens in some way. The government is for the people, right? That's what, when
Yeah.
people say government is for the people, that's what they mean. I mean, you can't discard the people for the sake of the government, without committing some kind of abuse that eliminates the entire point of it.
And so then when you're looking at the system, you use this principle to have further principles and principles and then ideas built on those principles. For example, one that we're all familiar with is the right to a speedy trial. That's built on the innocent until proven guilty. Because if you weren't innocent until proven guilty, it doesn't matter when you're tried. You know what I mean? If you're guilty until proven guilty, then we'll just try you whenever.
Then yes, we'll just hold you until you prove your innocence, right?
Yeah, exactly. And which is how the appeals process works. Because once you're proven guilty,
The assumption is you're guilty, yes.
The assumption is you're guilty. And if you can prove you're not, then you can get out of prison. But until you do, then the trial can take as long as we need it to. Unfortunately, while this is a principle everyone agrees with, it's not being well executed. As the fact that 1 out of 5 people currently incarcerated has not yet been tried is a serious problem. The fact that Arthur Coffey IV, who we talked about in relation to Kyle Rittenhouse, a few months ago, was not tried until several years after the incident occurred. Arthur Coffey IV was the man who the SWAT team broke into his house. The flashbang went off. He thought he was being shot at. He fired out the window. They fired in, killing his girlfriend, and then he ends up getting charged with attempted murder on them, as well as getting charged for the death of his girlfriend. And he ends up winning his self-defense argument on all of the murder charges, which is fantastic. But what's so rough about it is how long it took to get to that trial. Several years is far too long. And even if you're able to get bail, which not everyone is able to get, it's still going to impact your life. You cannot resume a normal life knowing that you're going to be on trial for murder in 6 months. Anyone who argues that it's a normal life leading up to a murder trial is just flat out wrong.
Yeah, your life is on hold.
Yeah, your life is on hold.
More than that, it's ruined. And
yeah, I mean, in many ways, it really is ruined. If you're applying for a job and you're like, no, I'm not a convicted murderer. Yes, I am currently going to be on. What's the term? I've been charged with murder. But they haven't found me guilty yet. Like, oh, well, that's fine. You know what I mean?
There's no world in which you get hired there, no matter how useful you seem to be, right? Maybe if it's your friend or something, someone who knows you're innocent, but
yeah, and so some kind of bail modification might seem like an effective solution to this problem, but it's really not. The only effective solution is something we discussed earlier, is to actually have a speedy trial. And so when you're looking at the laws that are currently in place and the laws that are being proposed to change, the best way to do it is to go back to the principles. Okay, well, why is a speedy trial important? It's not because we just believe in efficiency of government. No, it's because you're innocent until proven guilty.
Because it's unjust to hold someone who isn't guilty of a crime, and we're assuming innocence until you can prove otherwise. And why are we assuming that? For the reasons that we articulated. Right? These things. A speedy trial is a practical application of innocent till proven guilty. It's the embodiment of that principle in law. And it's something that we've let slip at our own peril, and it's a serious problem. There are other areas where innocent till proven guilty doesn't quite apply. There's a variety of niche crimes and things that we've mentioned before. Parental rights are a good example of them, where you're guilty until proven innocent, and there's a variety of ways in which the courts operate differently in particular jurisdictions that are problematic.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you have this one principle, right, innocent until proven guilty, what does that mean? Why? What does that look like in application? There used to be, and there still are some really gray areas for this. What police are allowed to do to try and get confessions, is one of those areas where it's
where it really should be looked at, because I think
Yes.
in many ways what police can do to get a confession is really a violation of this principle.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When whatever you think of what they can currently do, you don't have to go back very far at all to see what they used to do. It was legitimate abuse. Like it was, it wasn't, this has been something that's actually been steadily reforming. It has not been consistent. The constitutional law cases on this are really interesting in how to apply this particular principle in relation to the police interacting with suspects. What can you do and what can't you do before you have proven that they're guilty and obviously it's hugely important. You don't want them to be compelling people into confessions. You don't want people to be taking plea deals for crimes they didn't commit because they're worried.
Because they're afraid of a worse sentence.
And that is something which happens a lot. I'd be curious. We should pull up the numbers on that at some point. That'd be interesting.
Absolutely.
That's one principle.
So that's a principle that everyone can agree on. Now we're going to go into some of the principles that we've generated. Generated is a funny word. That we've discussed and come up with ideas, that principles that we think would be effective and are very logical in laying out a criminal justice system. So the next one we want to talk about is that there must be some form of disputed harm between two or more people. So, when there's a murder case, it's pretty straightforward, that there's harm committed against one or more people, between two or more people. There's the murderer, there's their victim, and potentially the other people who are harmed by that victim's death.
Right. If I go to my fridge and I eat a lot of fudge, you could argue that I have just harmed myself. If I took Brad and I tied him to a wall and fed him a bunch of fudge, obviously I've committed a crime.
Yeah, and one is worthy of a court case and one is not.
Right. In part, this is intuitive if you understand the basis for what a court is, and it's a place to solve disputes. And if I go and I eat a bunch of fudge, there's no dispute because there's only one party. You simply can't have a dispute between between the one crazy guy, I guess, and the voices in his head. That's not something that a court is fit to dispute, to solve the dispute of. And so
and that's where a lot of regulations come into play in terms of creating laws that result in people getting arrested and people, either getting harmed through taxes and fees, or in worst case scenarios, actually, serving prison time for doing something that had no disputed harm between two or more people. A great example of this is you go back to the drug example. The simplest version of this is that I could grow marijuana in my backyard, which is a plant. I can then harvest that marijuana and then sell it to Dan, my next door neighbor, because he wants it for whatever reason. And then I get arrested, I get tried in court, and then I serve prison time. And you say, okay, well, clearly he needs to be arrested because of the harm that he's causing. Well, where's the disputed harm? Dan's got arthritis and he's using my marijuana to help him with his arthritis, and I'm serving prison time because I wanted to help him with his arthritis.
Right.
And that's where you get into the real gray areas where it becomes clear that it's a problem.
Yeah, you have a mediating principle here about what constitutes a dispute and what doesn't, and you can see it when it helps when both parties are still alive. One of them will come dispute it, right? That's a pretty straightforward base, starting point. But you could also say that there's an element here that's critical, which is consent. Why would someone dispute it? Well, most times because it's something they didn't consent to. right? Something happened either contrary to what they consented to or that they didn't consent to. And so consent is tied up here in this idea of what is a legitimate dispute that must be handled by a third party, which is essentially what a court is, and what doesn't need to be handled by a third party. What isn't a legitimate dispute and what simply requires, I guess, the court's hand in a different way, which is like contract enforcement and things like that.
Well, and what's interesting about that drug example, Dan, is that the drug example really isn't different from you eating fudge and getting arrested for it. Because when you tell that story about me selling you marijuana, the response is, well, people have a right to step in because I'm harming you. You know what I mean? That through my drug sale to you, I'm harming you. But in reality, because of your consent, you're harming yourself, assuming that what you're buying is harming you. And I'm not
Yes.
saying that my story of you buying marijuana to help with arthritis, I'm not even sure if it does, but for pain management, I think
Yes.
it would help with arthritis, but it's not the point. I don't want to get too caught up in the details.
You're not
here.
making a medical claim here in addition to
I
exploring
just
legal
realized that I'm
principles.
over here espousing the virtues of marijuana for arthritis, and that was never what I wanted to do or even cared about.
It's not an intentional choice.
Hopefully we can get a sponsor going soon.
What you're really saying here, Brad, is take more marijuana, right? That's the message we want to get to the
if
kiddies.
That's not the message you're not, that you're not getting from me, then I'm doing it right. Anyways.
Now, you bring up a good point, though, in terms of, and we've discussed this in terms of economics, the process by which we determine harm, what harms us and what helps us, is not straightforward. It makes sense and it can be explained, right? You can rationally conceive of large portions of it. So we'll say Brad is selling brownies with marijuana in them, and I'm taking them medicinally. Now there's going to be side effects, or we could say it's something much more dangerous, right, than marijuana, some kind of high level, maybe it's morphine, right, or something like that. It's going to have a significant impact on me. In my mind, I'm assessing, assuming I'm consenting, right? I have made some kind of assessment about the pros and cons of this, that there's going to be, that I could decide a variety of things, and of the things I could decide that I've thought about and that are before me, I've put this one as the one I'm going to do based on the fact that I think it's going to bring me the greatest satisfaction or the greatest benefit, right, relative to other things. Which is to say, I have decided it's not harm, right? And even you could even go through
or
this,
that it's harm that you're okay with.
That it's harm. The level of harm is worth the benefit, right?
Yeah,
it's a trade-off. There are trade-offs here. Just like you could say that anything that takes time harms you in some sense because you're using a scarce resource, right? And that's irreplaceable.
Yeah, or anything that has risk, like mountain biking.
Yes.
Is a form of potential self-harm.
Right. Consent is the way that we mediate this thinking that is entirely subjective, that doesn't have a necessarily absolute truth to it, but has subjective truths. For me, this may be worth it, right? And only I could say that. No one else could say that.
And the reason why, Dan, is really rather simple. It's because what we're talking about is not just any form of intervention, but intervention by force.
Yes.
When we say that I'm selling Dan marijuana, we're not saying that no one should do anything.
Yes.
Or I'm telling him something more severe. We're not saying that no one should do anything and that what's happening is perfectly right.
Yes.
We're saying that what's happening here doesn't warrant forceful intervention. Yeah. It may warrant many things. It may warrant a concerned neighbor stopping by and having a conversation. It may warrant Dan's family members stepping in with slightly more aggressive persuasion of various forms. It may involve social shaming. It may involve unwillingness to participate on a professional or relationship level. You know what I mean?
Right.
There can be businesses that say, yeah, if you're going to be doing this, you can't work here. Or if there are businesses that say, yeah, you can't rent here if you're going to be doing that, et cetera, down the line. There are many ways that we are involved in each other's lives, and we're not saying to cut those avenues of influence off. We're just saying that in order for the criminal justice system to be based on principles of justice, and in order for them to step in through use of force, there has to be disputed harm.
Yes. That was
And
extremely
that's
well put.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much of your life that you should be doing that the government shouldn't step in and make you do. Right? This should be intuitive. Surely you can think of, everyone should be able to think of some things in their life that they're like, I should do that. A police officer should not stand over my shoulder with a gun to make sure I do it. Right? We separate these things. We distinguish these things because there are certain things that where violence is justified, where force is justified, and there are certain things where they're not. And we use the word justice in this podcast to distinguish those things.
Yeah, and that's something that most people agree with, when it comes to cigarettes. Everyone understands that cigarettes are harmful. Like it's not up for debate, it's not ambiguous. If you use tobacco, it's going to cause you bodily harm.
Mm-hmm.
And yet most people think that it's okay. Most people think that it's not the government's role to intervene in that process.
Yes. There's interesting arguments about that from the side where you go, well, these people are going to then use our healthcare, and then because of the toll it's going to take on our public resources, you have a right to compel them here, right? But this isn't the same as saying smoking ought to be criminal. This is a different claim. I would dispute both of them, but that other claim is of a different kind.
Yeah, and we're not going to worry about it here because I want to focus on the criminal justice side.
Right. So as you mentioned, Brad, that a person who has we have a lot of medical information about smoking. Someone smoking, maybe they're dying of cancer and they take up smoking, in which case the health effect is negligible, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But maybe there are cases where they're 10 and they've started smoking in the backyard and the parent really wants to intervene or something. And you can say pretty objectively, this is bad for them. But the vehicle by which you should affect that change, obviously a parent can impose all kinds of things for reasons we explored in a recent podcast. But as far as a third party, a concerned third party goes, there's lots of things you can do to help this person that do not require force. And if they think this is good for them, those other methods are the solution anyway. You need to persuade them that it's not, and that they can quit, and that they can, all these other things. If you don't do that, the force probably won't stop them anyway, unless you're willing to imprison them and keep it away from them. And at that point, you may be doing more harm than good.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the 10-year-old example because obviously, as we've discussed before, children are different than adults, and it creates a whole different set of variables.
Yeah, a parent can impose on them in ways that other people
but
can't.
But even in a situation where a 10-year-old decides to pick up smoking, where the parent does have a lot of leeway over their child that a government doesn't have over its citizen, doesn't mean that the parent is going to lock them in their room until they turn 18 because they caught them smoking once.
Yeah.
I mean, most parents won't, right? Most parents who catch their teenager doing something they shouldn't be doing, let's say smoking, they're going to have a conversation. There probably going to be punishments put in place. Your average parent,
rules and things.
There's going to be expectations going forward. And in some degree, there's going to be an element of force theoretically, but in most cases, there's really not. Most of parenting is not force, especially when you're talking about those ages. It's other things, and those other things are what's effective. In fact, you can look at those parents who do try and use force as much as possible, and you'll see more often than not that it doesn't work and just drives those kids towards the things that they're forbidden from. I know the number of kids who are told, hey, I can't have these sweets at home. So anytime I'm not at home, the first thing I do is go for those sweets.
Right. And as they get older, that gets more and more dangerous.
I know because me as a child, that's what it was for me. It's like, oh, we don't have any of this good stuff at home. So I developed a greater appreciation for all things sweet.
I was really old when I realized that soda was actually not super expensive. I just assumed based on the fact that everyone else had soda and we, but no, it's true. And obviously
But
this transitions into much more dangerous substances.
but where I was going with that is that parents understand another principle that that we've found, which is that intervention shouldn't be worse for the victim. And this is where you get into that self-harm question, because so much of the intervention that you can propose is actually worse for the victim than where they were pre-intervention. Smoking has a lot of harm on a person. Is it worse than life in prison? Most people would say
To
no.
keep them away from it if that's your absolute standard.
If that's your absolute standard, is that if push comes to shove and they won't quit, we try everything to stop them, our end result is we have to incarcerate them for the rest of their lives. Most people would agree that actually getting lung cancer at 60 and then dying is probably better than spending your entire life in prison.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think most people would agree with that.
Yeah, and you brought up a brilliant point there that should be stated several times because the people, I don't think, appreciate it. To make something illegal is to say exactly that if you refuse to stop, you're going to be in prison forever. Right?
Yeah.
That's the end effect of all criminal laws that are not observed, right? So
Yeah, which makes sense. Which makes sense with a lot of violent crimes, for example.
Yes. If it must
you kill
stop,
someone,
then so be
you're
it.
going to go to prison theoretically for life, and if it's not for life, then if you kill someone again, you better believe we're sending you back to prison. If you steal and then you steal again, you know what I mean? Each time we're going to do something about it. We're not going to say, "Oh, well, we acted once and we're done now." You know what I mean?
You're like, I guess
slapped
he didn't.
you on the wrist. Yeah, he didn't learn his lesson, so we give up.
No, I'm the opposite. It's escalating penalties for repeat offenses.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah, which brings up a point just worth spelling out. So often we simply conflate government as the organization by which the public comes together to act for the public good and do the things that would be good for people.
Yeah, which is just not true.
There's only so much you can do by force before you start to make things worse. And certainly in so many areas we've crossed well beyond the limit. And drug laws are a huge example of that, and a number of these other ones as well, where the cure is so much worse than the disease.
Yeah, absolutely. And so going back to that principle, intervention shouldn't be worse for the victim. This one has a lot of ramifications.
Yeah.
Drug laws are definitely one of those, because in that case, so many of those drug laws, what you're talking about is self-harm. And so the victim and the suspect are the same person. There's also a lot more areas that are like that. Literal self-harm, suicide, cutting, all of those things are the same thing. Where if you just throw them in prison for the rest of their life, are you really helping them?
Yes.
Other examples of this, we've already talked about this one before, but domestic abuse and a lot of those issues, intervention shouldn't be worse for the victim, and it needs to be a restraining principle that when you intervene in someone's life, there's going to be a cost, and so it has to be worth it.
Yes.
And so you have to factor that in. You have to remember that and think about it as you're crafting these laws, and as you're crafting the laws for how those laws are going to be enforced. It needs to be factored in.
Yes. So, you can take it to extreme examples and say, smoking, obviously, to throw someone in jail for life because they're smoking obviously doesn't help them, doesn't cure the problem, this is obviously a wrong place to interpose this. Whereas if someone's going around as a serial killer, you stop them if you have to kill them, right? You stop them at all costs. And as you move, as you narrow the range in there, it gets grayer and grayer. And there's going to be an area at which we're pretty close to the line. And there's
going to be some debate.
There's going to be disputes. But at this point, in large swaths of the law, we have simply accepted the mindset of, this is how we help people, is through government action and through criminal law, we can help to make people virtuous. There's I don't want to open that bag. but there's only so much you can make happen, right? With an adult human being, there's only so much. I mean, with a child, it's true too, but specifically in the realm of adults is where we're usually focusing. There's only so much you can change about them by the imposition of your will over theirs. Whereas there's lots that they have to be a willing participant in to change.
And that brings me to one that we actually haven't talked about, Dan, as we were preparing for this episode, but one that I've been trying to think of how to articulate. And it's that one of the core principles needs to be, and we can argue about the wording, I'm happy to, is that the purpose of the criminal justice system is to protect. So it's the purpose of the government is to protect the citizens from harm, in particular harm from others, but that the purpose needs to be to protect them. And I mention that because as you're talking about, more and more, we're looking at these laws and looking at this justice system, and we're thinking the purpose is to perfect humanity or to help people improve their lives. And as soon as that becomes the goal, you start running into problems. And that's when you have things like, the no large soda bans in New York City and other really silly laws, because the goal of those laws is not to protect people from crime. You know what I mean? It's not to protect you from violent acts from others. It's not to protect your property from being stolen. It's not to protect you from getting killed by someone. The purpose of that law is to help you be a better person. They're like, everyone generally wants to be healthier, but we can't muster the willpower individually. So we'll use the government and its instrument of force in order to force everyone to be better, and that will fix the problem. And on a kind of general level, you can see that, how that would make sense. You know what I mean? Like, I can see that for myself. Like, yeah, I have issues with self-control. And so if candy all came in smaller packages or there was a candy tax, so candy cost more, I probably would eat less candy. It probably wouldn't solve it altogether, but it could definitely help. But do I want the government's instrument of force to be the one behind that? I don't think so. And then you get back to the intervention shouldn't be worse for the victim and a lot of these other principles like the disputed harm, and they all can tie into that idea that the purpose of the criminal justice system is to protect people from really from violent crimes. And I'm using violent more broadly than just, physically hurting you, but I'm using it to include physically hurting you by taking away your property, physically hurting you by locking you up. All of the crimes that we're really concerned about fall into that category of violence.
Right.
And that should be the purpose of the criminal justice system, is to protect against that.
Yeah, the word harm may be odd to some of you to say that it should protect you from harm, but it's what's meant is the same exact idea as to protect your rights. It's the same concept, right? Your rights are tangible ways in which we assess what is yours and thus can be harmed, from varying from your body to your property to other things. But yeah, it's in case there's any confusion, it's the same idea. Harm is kind of the culminant. Harm is just a way to state that more concisely, I think, and a way to think about it from the other direction. You think of rights from one way and harm in another. So there's a variety of other things here.
Well put, Dan. Well put.
As I say that, I'm checking.
Everyone, we have not covered all things in relation to this topic. We're close. I believe there are 3 things left, Dan, that have ever been said about this topic.
That's right.
Or am I wrong? Is it actually just 2?
Well, 3, and then we'll invent a 4th, and then the world should have a comprehensive resource for this.
This episode has everything you need to know about the criminal justice system, period.
Once
we cover those 3 things.
One of the others, and I've struggled to state this in a principle, but one at least one more, I suppose, and Brad, you may have another you want to throw in.
Go.
Is the idea that if there is a dispute, there are varying ways in which we could effectively address the dispute depending on the willingness of the victims. Right now, we have one system for this. The only system, really.
Yeah, the court system.
The court system, as we know it, functions in a particular way. You have, and a lot of it is very good. You have an adversarial system in which the two parties try to come to the truth. And in cases where it's important, like criminal cases, you have a jury of your peers to help navigate that and decide, the truth of it, right? Figure out what happened. All of this is very good. I don't want to, that should not be thrown away by any means. But occasionally what you have is you don't need that same level of adversarial opposition because what happened isn't really in dispute. And the parties, rather than having a system that deals with, what's the word? That acts in opposition to the offender, right? To the guilty party, and sentences them from on high. What you could do is you could actually work with the offender to find a solution to the problem. And this makes a lot more sense if you're thinking of it in the absence of government. Because in government we have this one thing, and this is what we do with people. But if you have a problem between two children, we can see this a lot better. There's times where your kid takes the toy from another kid, and it's the other kid's toy, and your kid is not going to give it back, right? And you act like our court systems. You're the jury, you're the judge, you're the arbitrator, and you go, give me that, and you give it back to the person, and your kid goes away crying, right? There are other times where your kid feels guilty, and where your kid realizes they've done something wrong. They really wanted this toy. But at that point, it can be a fundamentally different experience because your kid can be a participant in righting the wrong. And we've explored this at length in our episode of on restorative justice. The term restorative justice used to refer to this kind of thing. In some ways, it's being co-opted for other things at this point. But in cases where both the person who has been harmed and the person who did the harming are willing, you can address and go through this process in an entirely collaborative way. The two parties, instead of being set apart, never communicating, come together. They discuss what the problem was. They talk about their experience. They then establish a solution that's acceptable to both of them. And they solve the problem.
A great example of how this can be effective, because to clarify, restorative justice, because when people talk about restorative justice, it kind of just sounds like therapy. and that's where I think we kind of miss the mark, because typically when we're talking about restorative justice, we are talking about situations where there is harm that may not be fully disputed, but there's usually some dispute. There's harm that happened that requires intervention. And so the government does need to intervene and does need to find a solution to this, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in the court system. I think an area where this could be incredibly effective is going back to the domestic abuse, where you don't want the intervention to be worse for the victim than the actual crime, but you do need to intervene because we don't want to look at domestic abuse and say, hey, we're just going to be hands off, because it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. But how the court system is set up right now is crap for domestic abuse. You know what I mean? Because they have these rigid requirements set in place that funnels you towards a few outcomes. You know, you can separate them and you can throw one in prison, and those are basically your only options. You know what I mean? You got the restraining order and you've got prison time. You know what I mean? And that's just it's not enough. It's not nuanced and flexible enough to deal with something as complicated as violence inside of an intimate relationship, because that's not simple and it doesn't have one word answers. And so being able to have a restorative justice system where you have a government representative who does have some of the power that a judge has within limits, and you have both parties who, even though one is a guilty party and one is a victim, are willing to come together and have honest conversations and have and meet in a unique situation and meet in a way that's different than a courtroom, that allows people to come up with alternative solutions that can potentially benefit everyone. You open the door to possibilities, to solutions that were never looked at before.
Yes, and simply can't be had without this kind of open-ended
that can't
willingness.
be had in a courtroom. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I guess if I were to state the principle, it came to me as you were talking, it's this. You need to at least have justice, but you could have more if the parties are willing to reach for more. Right? You could have a kind of restoration and relationship with some kind of healing, for lack of a better word, some kind of redemption story here, in which the person goes through a process that satisfies the person who has been harmed, that has been negotiated between them, that addresses the problems and restores this person fully to society in a way that a penal justice system can't.
Yeah, and that goes back to, well, what is the purpose of the justice system? The justice system, the purpose is to protect us, the citizens, from violence. And so as long as you're able to do that, as long as you're able to make sure that when you're looking at restorative justice, you see that there's this violence that has occurred, and what can you do to protect against that violence in the future? And you need to make sure that you're still considering that. And that's where I think some modern versions of restorative justice fall flat, is it becomes, okay, well, let's just fix the guilty party. You know what I mean? And that's not what we're saying here.
No.
It's more than that, and it's very different than that.
No, what we're talking about, I keep emphasizing that it's a willing process on both parties for it to work, because generally the way the term has been co-opted today is restorative justice is the term for a new idea of justice in which we accept the materialist claim that you are entirely a product of your environment. And so you don't really deserve punishment. It's just how you've been shaped. And so we're going to take you like clay and shape you into something better. Right? This is fundamentally different in how it views the participation of the people involved, right? It can also be, restorative justice can also be a gateway into restoration in the sense of social justice, and so that's a bummer that the term, by the time I discovered the term a few years later, it was being destroyed, but didn't take very long. Get excited about some nice new word and shiny new word, and here it is, ruined by politics, like most things. There could be other conversations we can have on this along these same lines about things like regulations, which are obviously something different, right? It's not, no crime per se has been committed, but there has been some standard that's been failed to keep, and it hasn't been met, and as such, people are, there's some kind of punishment affixed. We can talk about business law, where there are real crimes being committed, but because the corporation is the entity that you're dealing with, there's no punishment given at all.
Yeah, the way that LLCs and how company designations work actually protect these companies from criminal liability in a way that is completely unjust.
Yeah, where you're getting fines when you should be getting jail time.
Well, yeah, exactly, when people should actually be punished, be stopped from committing that act again, because once again, the goal is to protect against that violence, and violence is being committed by individuals. Corporations are not real beings that are independent from humanity.
Yeah, we're not punishing
separating
the
them in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Doesn't work, which is why shell companies are such a joke, that, oh, well, the shell company made that drug, and so that drug's bad. Okay, well, that shell company went bankrupt. Great.
We just erase that on the paper. Yeah.
Yeah, even though the company that actually did it and the people who actually did it are continuing to do whatever they were doing.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that same argument being made for serial killers? It's like, oh, well, I created an identity. His name was Killer Jones, and he killed those people. But Killer Jones, yeah, he's spending the rest of his life in prison. But me, Sam Jones, yeah, I'm going to walk.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that makes no sense.
No, the corporate shell game and the shield that it is for liability and things was a massive twist from the common law heritage that we have and from what were legit legal principles that it was based in. And it was an effort to steer society, right? They were like, we actually want businesses of this kind, so we're going to give them special permissions to be corporations. This was before it was common, right? It was a special privilege initially. And then it just became the norm. But anyway, yes. The business law, the regulatory sphere in which you're mitigating risk and things like that.
Yeah, risk laws, things like traffic laws or gun laws, those are controversial, but definitely worth addressing because it gets back into that harm and risk and all of that, which is a discussion worth having maybe at another time because gun laws and traffic laws could each probably handle an episode.
Yeah, for now I'll settle for, getting of the 2.3 million, say 1 million of them out of prison and away from criminal charges that they don't deserve because it's some kind of self-harm. Because
and not 1 million getting released out of prison because we need to fix the numbers, but 1 million getting released from prison because about 1 million of them are there unjustly and should never be there in the first place, and that's why they need to be released.
Yes, and some of it is downstream of the laws that need to change. Drugs being example number one there, and that the violence happens downstream of the illegality of the drugs, which means you can change the number of violent crimes, which we do want prosecuted, but you can reduce that simply by changing the legality of drugs and other things.
Yeah, but a decent number could be clear cut enough that we're talking commuted sentences.
That's right.
That there are a good number of people in prison currently.
Yeah, at least 500,000 who you could just release if you change the laws so that the system as it is doesn't function quite the way it does. And with that, thank you for listening.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.